kitchen smelled like burnt coffee. That's the first thing I noticed when my son walked through the door that Sunday. Not that he looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him. Not that his hands were shaking when he set his keys on the counter. The coffee, I'd left it on too long and the whole room had that bitter, scorched smell, and I was embarrassed about it, and I said something stupid like, I was going to make a fresh pot. He said, "It's fine, Mom." But he wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the window. My son. I'll call him by what I always called him at home, just by his name. Callum had driven 4 hours to have Sunday dinner with me. He hadn't told me he was coming. I'd gotten the text at 11 that morning that said leaving now, be there by 2. No explanation. That wasn't unusual for him exactly. He was never one for long messages, but something about the way he typed it felt different. Flat. Like a man checking a box. He was 41 years old. He'd built a software company from nothing, starting in a 1-bedroom apartment with 1 employee, which was himself. By the time he sold it, partial sale, 6 years ago, he had enough money that neither of us would ever have to worry again. He bought me a new roof. He paid off my car. He told me to pick a vacation and he'd cover it. I picked Savannah because it was close and I'd always wanted to see the squares, and we spent 4 days walking around in the heat and eating shrimp and grits, and it was the best trip of my life. He married his wife. I'll call her what she is, my daughter-in-law. 3 years before that trip, I tried with her. I want to be honest about that. I tried very hard in the beginning. She was pretty and smart, and she had opinions about everything, which I respect in a person even when I disagree. Her family had money too, old money, the kind that comes with a way of looking at people who earned theirs instead of inheriting it. I noticed it the first time we had dinner together, all of us at their house, and her father kept asking Callum questions about his business in a tone that was less curious and more assessing, like he was calculating whether my son was worth the trouble. Callum didn't seem to notice, or he noticed and decided not to care. Either way, he loved her and she seemed to love him, and I kept my mouth closed and my opinions to myself because that's what mothers do when their children are happy. The Sunday he drove to see me, he was not happy. I set a plate in front of him. I'd made pot roast because I always made pot roast on Sundays, out of habit, out of the muscle memory of feeding a family that had mostly scattered, and he ate maybe 4 bites, and then just sat there with his fork resting on the edge of the plate. I said, "Are you feeling all right?" He said, "I need to talk to you about something." I sat down. The coffee maker was still hissing. I should have turned it off earlier. He told me he'd been moving money. Not hiding it, he said. Moving it. Restructuring things. He'd talked to his financial advisor and to a lawyer, and he transferred a significant portion of his assets into a trust with my name on it. He said significant, and then he said the number, and I made him say it again because I thought I'd misheard. $12 million. I told him I didn't want it. I told him to take it back. He shook his head in that way he's had since he was a teenager, slow and deliberate, the way he looked when he'd already made up his mind and was just waiting for me to catch up. "It's done," he said. "It's already in your name." "It's been in your name for 3 weeks. I asked him why. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the window again. Outside it was raining, a light, steady drizzle, and the light in the yard was gray and flat. "I just needed to know it was safe," he said. I didn't understand what that meant. I asked him if he and his wife were having problems. He said not exactly. I asked him if something was wrong with the company. He'd started a second venture, smaller, consulting work mostly, and he said no. I asked him if he was sick. He looked at me then, really looked at me, the way he hadn't since he'd walked in. "I'm not sick," he said. "I just needed it to be somewhere safe. With someone I trust, that's all." He left around 6. He hugged me at the door and held on a little longer than usual. I told him to text me when he got home. He said he would. He didn't. I waited until almost midnight and then I called him and he didn't answer. I told myself he was tired from the drive and had gone straight to sleep. I told myself that in the morning I would call again and he would answer and I would ask him to explain, really explain, what was going on. I made myself go to bed. His wife called me at 7:45 the next morning. She didn't cry. I remember that. I remember thinking, in some detached corner of my mind that was still functioning, that she wasn't crying. She spoke in a very controlled voice and she told me that Callum had been found unresponsive in the night, that they had called an ambulance and that he was gone. She said the words, "He is gone," the way you'd say, "He is traveling" or "He is unavailable." I don't remember the rest of that phone call. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed afterward with the phone still in my hand, staring at the carpet. He was 41 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. He had no known heart condition. The autopsy. I insisted on an autopsy. I called the county medical examiner myself, and I insisted. Found nothing conclusive. They used words like idiopathic and no identifiable external cause, and I wrote all of it down in a notebook because I didn't trust myself to remember. I called my own lawyer 3 days after the funeral, not because I suspected anything specific, because I'd been reading through the trust documents Callum had sent me in an email I hadn't opened until after he died. And there was a note at the bottom, in the body of the email, below the attachments. "Mom, if you're reading this after something happened to me, don't meet with anyone from her family without your lawyer present. Don't sign anything. Don't let them in the house. I love you." I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I called my lawyer. Her name is Mrs. Answorth. She'd handled my husband's estate 12 years ago and I'd kept her number, and I told her everything. The transfer, the trust, the visit, the email. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about her, and when I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't speak to anyone from that family without me on the phone or in the room." Not a word. I said, "They haven't contacted me." She said, "They will." She was right. My daughter-in-law called 11 days after the funeral. She was pleasant. She said she knew this was a difficult time and she was sorry for my loss, her phrasing, my loss, as though Callum belonged only to me, and that her family wanted to get together to discuss some financial matters related to the estate. She mentioned, almost in passing, that they had documentation suggesting certain assets had been transferred improperly in the months before Callum's death, and that a conversation now, before things became formal, would be in everyone's best interest. I said, "I'll have my attorney contact yours." Silence. Then she said, "There's no need to involve lawyers at this stage." I said, "There is. Have your attorney call Mrs. Answorth." I gave her the number and I got off the phone. My hands were shaking when I hung up. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Callum had eaten 4 bites of pot roast and stared at the window, and I thought about the word improperly, about the way she'd said it. Easy. Practiced. That afternoon I went to Callum's apartment. His wife hadn't been living there since the week of the funeral. She'd gone to stay with her parents, which I thought was strange, but I didn't say so. The apartment manager let me in because Callum had put me on the lease as an authorized contact 2 years before. I found that out from a document in the same folder as the trust papers. He'd been preparing for something. I understand that now. I walked through his apartment slowly. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just present, standing in the rooms he'd stood in, looking at his bookshelf, at the framed photo of the 2 of us in Savannah on the nightstand, at the half-used bottle of vitamins on the kitchen counter, in the back of his closet, in a shoebox he'd labeled miscellaneous in his handwriting. I found an envelope. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a folded piece of paper. The paper said, "Mom, drive has audio, January through April, you'll understand." I took it home. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I plugged in the drive and I understood. There were 11 recordings. Callum had made them himself, some on his phone, some on a small digital recorder, the kind reporters use. They were recordings of conversations. His wife, her brother, her father. Several I didn't recognize by voice. Most of them were about money. About his company, about the value of certain assets, about a policy, a life insurance policy that Callum had, apparently, recently increased to $4 million at the suggestion of his father-in-law. Her father had a financial advisory firm. He had steered Callum towards certain investments and away from others over the course of the marriage. In the recordings you could hear the slow, careful pressure of it, the way a river wears at a bank. The recording that stopped my breath was from March. Callum and his wife in what sounded like their bedroom, her voice low and careful. "You just need to sign it. It's a formality. I've read it twice." "That's not what this is." My father had his lawyer look at it. "It's standard. It transfers ownership of the IP. That's not standard." Her voice changed then, went from careful to something with an edge to it. "You don't trust me. I trust you. I don't trust your father." Long pause. That's not something I can unhear, Callum. The recording ended there. 3 weeks after that recording, he drove to my house in the rain and told me the money was safe. That he'd needed it to be safe. With someone he trusted. I took the USB drive to Mrs. Answorth's office the next morning and I put it on her desk and I told her everything. I want to tell you what happened over the next 4 months clearly without overstating it. The family had retained an estate attorney and filed a formal challenge to the trust within 6 weeks of the funeral, claiming Callum had been unduly influenced in the transfer, meaning they were claiming that I had manipulated my dying son into giving me his money. My son, who drove 4 hours on a Sunday with shaking hands because he was afraid. The recordings were admissible. Mrs. Answorth made sure of that. The insurance policy was the piece that broke the case open. The $4 million policy her father had encouraged Callum to take out, the one that had been increased in January, 6 months before his death. The beneficiary had been changed. Callum had originally listed me, sometime in February, without Callum's signature, a signature that a handwriting expert would later confirm was forged. The beneficiary had been changed to his wife. The insurance company had been in the process of paying out when we flagged it. The investigation that followed was not quick. It was not clean. There were months of waiting and months of documents and months of phone calls with Mrs. Answorth that left me exhausted in ways I hadn't been since my husband died. My daughter-in-law's attorney was good. Her father's attorney was better. They had money and they had patience, and they believed, I think, that I was a 63-year-old woman alone and that I would get tired and let it go. I did not let it go. I want to be clear, we could not prove what I believe killed my son. The autopsy said idiopathic. That word will sit in my chest for the rest of my life. What we could prove, what the evidence showed, what the investigators found when they looked hard enough at the financial records and the policy documents and those 11 recordings, was fraud, wire fraud, insurance fraud, forgery. Her father lost his financial advisory license. His firm is under federal investigation. Her brother, who appears on 2 of the recordings discussing the insurance policy in ways that were impossible to explain away, has been charged. My daughter-in-law was served with a civil suit and a separate fraud investigation is ongoing. None of it brings him back. I know that. I have known that since 7:45 on the morning she called me. But I think about that Sunday in my kitchen. I think about him eating 4 bites of pot roast and looking at the window. I think about him holding on a little longer than usual at the door. I think about the fact that he knew, that some part of him knew, and that he did the one thing he could think to do, which was to make sure I was the one holding the evidence. He trusted me to figure it out. I think about that every day. The Savannah photo is on my nightstand now. I moved it here from a shelf in the hallway where it had been for years. I look at it in the mornings before I get up. We're standing in one of the squares under a canopy of oak trees, and he has his arm around my shoulders, and we are both squinting in the sun, and we are laughing at something. I don't even remember what. Just that something made us both laugh at the same moment, and whoever was holding the camera caught it. That's what I have, that and the fact that I didn't let them win. Mrs. Answorth told me early on that most people in my position back down, that the pressure is too much, the process is too long, the other side has too many resources. She said it not to discourage me but to tell me what I was choosing. I told her he drove 4 hours in the rain to make sure this money was safe. The least I can do is make sure it means something. She nodded and opened a new folder on her desk and we got to work. I still make pot roast on Sundays. Out of habit. Out of muscle memory. I set 1 plate now instead of 2. But I make it anyway. People ask me sometimes, not directly but in the way people circle around a thing, whether I think it was worth it. The months of depositions, the phone calls with Mrs. Answorth that left me sitting at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with cold tea and a headache I couldn't shake. The moments when I genuinely didn't know if any of it would hold, whether the recordings would matter, whether the forged signature would be enough, whether I, a 63-year-old woman with no legal background and no powerful family behind me, could stand up to people who had been doing this kind of thing, the quiet, careful dismantling of other people's lives for money, for a very long time. It was worth it. I want to say that plainly, without drama, because I think the truth of it is plain. But I also want to say something else, something I've been turning over since all of this ended, or at least since the part that ends in courtrooms and signed documents ended. Because the rest of it, the grief, the missing him, the Sunday afternoons, that doesn't end. That just changes shape. What I keep coming back to is this. Callum did everything right with what he had. He couldn't stop what was happening to him. He was one person and there were several of them, and they had been working at him for years, slowly, the way you don't notice the water wearing at the stone until the stone is already changed. But within the limits of what he could do, he was smart and he was careful and he protected what mattered to him. He found an attorney. He structured the trust correctly. He made the recordings. He left me the note. He held on long enough to make sure the evidence existed. That's not a small thing. Most people, when they are afraid, go quiet. They go along. They tell themselves it will get better, that they are overreacting, that the people around them couldn't possibly mean them harm. Callum didn't do that. He was afraid. I know he was afraid. I heard it in the way he sat at my table and couldn't eat, and he did the work anyway. I think about that when I feel like I don't have the energy to keep going on something, when a problem feels too large or too old or too entrenched to move. I think about my son, 41 years old, driving 4 hours in the rain with shaking hands, doing the next right thing because he understood that doing nothing was its own kind of choice. The people who tried to take what he built, they made choices too. Every step of it was a choice. The forgery, the policy, the pressure, the phone call to me 11 days after I buried my child, smooth-voiced, asking me not to involve lawyers. Each of those choices had a weight, and the weight accumulated, and eventually it became something that couldn't be walked back from. That's not luck. That's not fate. That's just the simple math of actions and their consequences played out over time. I am not a perfect person. I made mistakes in this process. There were moments when I was angry in ways that weren't useful, when fear made me sharp with people who were trying to help me. I have to live with those moments too. But I showed up. Every time Mrs. Answorth needed a document, I found it. Every time I had to sit across a table from people who looked at me like I was an inconvenience to be managed, I stayed in my chair and I kept my voice level and I did not let them see that my hands were shaking under the table. I showed up because Callum trusted me too, and because I was not willing to be the reason his last careful act meant nothing. The photo from Savannah is still on my nightstand. Some mornings I look at it and I just miss him. Some mornings I look at it and I feel something closer to gratitude, that we had those 4 days, that whoever was holding the camera caught that moment, that I have something real to hold on to. Both of those things are true at the same time. That's the part they don't tell you. That grief and gratitude are not opposites, that you can carry both and still get up and make the coffee and do the next right thing. That's what I'm trying to do.